So, boys and girls, Paul McCartney probably doesn't mean anything to you, and maybe doesn't mean anything to many people here, but he is a famous singer, was a famous singer, and he's just brought out another song which I find very, very interesting, and it's titled "The Days We Left Behind." And he's looking back on his life, and he remembers some aspects of his life, and he has reflections on his life's experience, the days we left behind. One of the lines in his song is, "No one can erase the days we left behind." That what has been done has been done. And perhaps there is the implication in that line within his song that we might want to erase some of the days that we have left behind. That there are things we are ashamed of, things we wish we had never done, perhaps that we'd worked harder at school. But those days are past and ended. And here in this second introductory chapter in the book of Exodus, Moses, the author, is looking back on his life from a way at towards the end of his days. And he is seeing and understanding the events which happened then, and having the recognition which is implied there and made more explicit at the end of the chapter, that God was working in everything that was happening from his childhood, his adulthood, right throughout all of his days. And what a chapter it is for us to come to think of this evening. A chapter which ends the introductory parts of Exodus, introducing to us Moses, who will be the main character in the Old Testament books right up until the end of Deuteronomy. This chapter joining on to chapter 1, which linked to the end of Genesis and then introduces the book of Exodus. The chapter has two time markers in it, one in verse 11, one day when Moses had grown up, and the other in verse 23, during those many days the king of Egypt died. And this divides this chapter into three parts, verses 1 to 10, 11 to 22, and 23 to the end. The first part has one word in Hebrew which is mentioned 7 times. The second paragraph has another different Hebrew word which is also mentioned 7 times. And as we journey through the books of Moses, we will see evidence that here is a very smart man. Here is a man whom the Holy Spirit has taken the talents which he honed and learned, educated in the best universities of the world. And in his writings are all these structures and syntaxes and ways which people reading it originally in the Hebrew would be able to retain and remember the stories. And so that the word in the first paragraph is the word child, highlighting the main theme of that first paragraph, the childhood of Moses. And then in the second paragraph, covering the years from the age of 40 to 80, is the Hebrew word man, used 7 times, indicating that this paragraph is covering the maturer age of Moses when he had grown up in his manhood. And so this evening we're thinking of these two aspects of Moses' life and reflections on his life in his childhood and then in his manhood and occurrences which happened then, and then ending with this focus on God and his presence in all of this, and him working out every detail of every life for his glory, for his good. And as we come this evening to journey through this chapter, we're to hold on to its ending and allow it to trickle down into every part of this chapter, that this sovereign God, that this present God, that this all-knowing God, that the chapter ends with this phrase, "and God knew," is present right throughout the whole experience. of Moses and of us all. So we're thinking of our childhood in verses 1 to 10. And the main emphasis in thinking of the childhood in this paragraph is that our childhood is planned. There are two parties which were particularly influential in the childhood of Moses. There were his parents and then his benefactor, the princess. His parents' actions are wonderful, mentioned in verses 1 to 3 and reflected on by the writer to the Hebrews, which we read together. So here in verse number 1, his parents are not mentioned, that their names are not here. They'll come in chapter 6, Amram and Jochebed. But here, the focus is on Moses. The writer here is reluctant to mention names. And the focus, in this chapter anyway, and the focus is on the fact that Moses is a true Israelite. His mother and his father were from the tribe of Levi. The phrase in verse 2 is significant, I think. The woman conceived and bore a son. It was a phrase used 15 times by the writer of Genesis. This is the 16th time, and this is the last time that this phrase is used. And as you think about this, this is obviously deliberate. He's mentioning 15 significant births through the account in Genesis of the unfolding of God's people and the growth of God's people. And it's all coming up to this birth, to Moses, the servant of God, the receiver of the law, the bringer of the sacrificial system to the people of God. The parents see him in verse number 2 as a fine child, a difficult expression, described as beautiful in Hebrews 11, which we read together. What was it about this child? He wasn't their first child. Miriam was older. Aaron was older. Miriam's probably about 12 by now. Aaron's 3 years older than Moses. This was their third child. But he was a fine child. Is it just a physical beauty that they see here? Or is there more spiritual and supernatural prophecy and insight given to them that this third child is destined to be a servant of God? They lived near the palace, as verse 7 indicates. And so when his mother had been hiding him for 3 months, she realized that his crying will become too loud. She'll not be able to rock him to sleep as she was able to do after 3 months. He'll be starting crawling around. She won't be able to hide him so easily because of their proximity to the palace. And so she begins to think about what she will have to do. And in verse 3, she exercises great shrewdness, great wisdom, great faith. And she obeys the edict of Pharaoh. She puts her baby male son in the Nile. But she does it in an act of faith and in an act of wisdom. Papyrus was used for writing. It was used for making shoes. It was used for making small boats. And she formed this floating casket for her baby son. Now, perhaps she was inspired by stories from ancient times of babies who were abandoned in rivers and left there and put in little boats. Sargon, the king of Mesopotamia, who became the king of Mesopotamia, began his life, the ancients said, in that manner. But it's possible and more likely that Jochebed was influenced in her behavior here by the preservation of Noah in the ark in the flood. And the basis of making that assertion is that the word in verse 3, basket, the Hebrew word for basket, is only used in the Bible here and in Genesis chapter 6 to 8 of Noah's ark. And it's likely that Jochebed, this woman of tremendous faith, along with her husband, looked back to God preserving Noah in the flood in dangerous times. And she put her trust in this same God, that he would preserve her son in dangerous times in an ark in the waters. She put it in the reeds, a place of shade, a place of anchorage. Desi Alexander, the top commentary recommended by Ligonier, he thinks that she didn't intend Moses to be found by the woman who bathed in the Nile. John L. Mackay, the fourth top commentary recognized by Ligonier, thinks she did intend for Moses to be found by the woman who bathed in the Nile. It was common for women to bathe in the Nile. There were paintings and monuments that one has been discovered of this very practice. This was something she knew was happening in the river nearby her. But whether she intended or not, her faith was in God as she placed Moses in the Nile. This God mentioned at the end of the chapter, in his sovereignty, worked out these events. And so the daughter of Pharaoh came down. And it's likely that her name is Hatshepsut. And she is known in ancient history. She is known as being a woman who's strong-willed, who won't submit to others' laws. She was the daughter of Thutmose III. And when she married Thutmose II, who lived for a short time and died under suspicious circumstances, Thutmose III was young. He was married to Hatshepsut's daughter, and because he was young, he ruled alongside Hatshepsut for a number of years. He hated her, and when she died, he expunged her name from all the royal records. And so it's perhaps her, Hatshepsut. She comes. She sees this ark in the bulrushes. She asks her assistant to fetch her. She opens up this casket, and there she discovers a Hebrew child, evident by the clothes, by the area in which the baby is, by the edict that has been given to put the male boys into the Nile. Then God's amazing providence, this strong-minded, strong-willed woman, she refuses to obey her father's edict. And she makes other arrangements for the preservation of this child. Miriam, probably 12 years of age at this time, offers to get help for this princess. The Egyptian woman wouldn't nurse a male son themselves, but they would get someone else to do this. And so Miriam latches on to this, and she probably, the princess is aware of all that's going on, tells her to go and get this nurse, whom she anticipates is her mother, his mother. And so Moses, as he will be named by this princess, which means son of, Moses is taken to his own mother's house. And it was common for babies not to be weaned until they were 3 or 4 years of age. And it was the normal practice for Egyptian children in royal palaces not to begin their education until 9 or 10 years of age. And so it is possible that Moses remained with his own natural mother, taught about God, taught about the promises given to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, well doctrinated until the age of 10, with the gracious application of it to his heart by the Holy Spirit, before he was eventually brought in verse 10 to the palace where the princess was, to be then educated in law and administration and languages and military tactics and in leadership, and in God's providence prepared in the next 30 years for all the work that God had him to do. So what a childhood this is. A childhood, as Moses reflects on it and writes under the inspiration of the scriptures, which was dominated in his record by outstanding woman. There's his mother. There's his brave sister. There's this beneficent, strong-minded princess, all nameless, but all female, and all cogs in God's incredible machinery of redemption and grace. They all have a part to play. They're all valuable, they're all noted, they're all remembered, they're all important. And I hope the women in our congregation who don't have positions of official leadership are valued, because we do value you and we want to value you more. The influence that you bring, the example that you set, the care that you show, the service that you give has a tremendous and important place as the woman here in God's kingdom, in the working out of God's purpose, of God's grace, and in the nurturing and developing and shaping of future leaders and of the children that God has gifted us in our congregation. Just as at the resurrection, women dominated the early appearances of Jesus to his people, so here, in Moses' early life, woman had a ministry, faith, courage, and influence for God. Faith of parents is tremendous here. Amram and Jochebed trusting God to keep Moses, to keep him as they placed him in the River Nile. What a moment that was for any mother. Maybe he was just placed there during the day and then he was taken in at night. Maybe it wasn't even a day that he lingered out there on the Nile. But what faith. And then that moment in verse number 10, recorded here, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. What a moment that was. We're not to think that Moses never had any further contact with his siblings or with his mother, because later on in his life he's very familiar with Aaron and with Miriam. There was doubtless interaction between Moses and his home family all the time that he was growing up in the palace in Egypt. But what a moment when she saw the little figure disappearing in through the palace doors. What faith, what trust that God will keep him, that the education that he had brought to her for those first 10 years would take root in his life and bear fruit in his mind and in his heart. What faith and what example to us as parents as we bring our children up, recognizing the many pressures, temptations, godlessness that surrounds them all, to trust God, that he will keep them, that he will hold them, that he will cause that seed of his word, which we in all our failings and weaknesses have sought to bring to them, that he will cause that word to grow and mature and develop within their hearts. And how incredible this insight is into how God brings people into our lives. Isn't that amazing? This princess, and if it is Hatshepsut, and we can read up about her, how amazing that it was her that found the ark. Her with a sympathetic heart, her with the power and ability to preserve and bring in this future leader of God's people. This encounter that day between this princess and this casket in the Nile. And I'm sure we can all look back and see how God brought people into our lives, or kept people out of our lives, that has shaped the direction of our life. How you met your husband or your wife, how you've ended up in the job that you are. There's that wonderful story in the early years of Charles Spurgeon when he was beginning preaching and everyone was telling him he shouldn't go to college. This is probably going to do me out of a job. Then don't be going to college. And so he buckled to all this pressure. Do go to college, they said to him. So he buckled under this pressure of all this advice to go to college. And he went to a house to meet with the principal of a college. And the maid showed Spurgeon into one room, but showed the principal into a different room when he arrived later. And after an hour, the principal thought that Spurgeon had never turned up, and Spurgeon thought the principal had never turned up, and the principal had to leave for a further engagement. And this was a meeting that never happened, all in God's purpose for his most useful servant. Here's the childhood, a childhood ordered, controlled, supervised, ordained by God. How wonderfully instructive for all parents, and for us all. The second part then moves on to the 40 years. It flies over those early experiences of Moses in the palace. We would love to know more, wouldn't we? Who taught him, what he learned, how he grew. Was he top of his class? He probably was. But in verse 11, we find him at 40 years of age. And in this section, verses number 11 to verse number 22, we see three evidences of Moses' sense of justice, that he's on the side of the underdog. And in any circumstances, and this will become more evident in his life as he journeys through and leads God's people, here is a man with a sense of justice. And three encounters he has. He stands up for those who are being oppressed. So the first one is he sees the Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, and Moses kills this taskmaster. The second one is two Hebrew men having a go at each other, and Moses intervenes here, and evidently the man whom he had preserved the day before, it turns on Moses because the people of Israel have got heat on them. The day before, an Egyptian taskmaster has been killed, murdered. The suspicion, the investigation is in all these Hebrew slaves. Who did this? And their oppression has been ranked up. And so this man recognizes Moses and is not too pleased that he's still hanging around. He's the cause of all the increased oppression that they're experiencing. And Moses realizes that his action has been relayed to others. And he recognizes that Thutmose III, who hates his adopted mother, Hatshepsut, will not spare him. And so he flees east from the hatred and the investigation that will seek him out to the region of Mount Sinai, to the nomadic tribe of Midian, who were descendants of Abraham and Keturah from Genesis chapter 25. And in the third event, he's there in the land of Midian. It seems that he's been there for some time, observing the bullying behavior of the shepherds. You see in verse number 15, Moses fled and stayed in the land of Midian. So the daughters of Jethro or Reuel, they would draw the water, they would put this around the wells for their flocks to come and drink from, but the bullies would move them out of the way in their flocks, and they would feed or water their own livestock, and then the ladies, the daughters, would have to draw the water all again. And Moses, with this sense of justice, he stands up for them, and he waters their herds and flocks. And then he's taken to Jethro's house. He's given Zipporah to wife, and a child, Gershom, is born, whom he calls sojourner. A sojourner in Egypt, perhaps, or a sojourner in Midian. But this is a real time of development in Moses' life. This is a new phase, a new stage in his experience. And the book of Hebrews enters into this. And the first aspect of that development in Hebrews 11:23 is that he refuses to be called Pharaoh's daughter's son. He refuses. He chooses God's people. See verse 11, the phrase twice, out to his people, beating a Hebrew, one of his people. Moses didn't enter fully into the culture and ways and wealth and power and privilege and prestige of the Egyptians. He always held on to this, that his people were the ones who are being oppressed, the ones who are being enslaved. So was there a moment? Was there a public official renunciation when he refused to be called the son of the daughter of Pharaoh? You see in verse number 11 that he looked on their burdens. As this prolonged study, he was watching, he was taking in what was happening. He was understanding that his people were being oppressed and subjected. He believed the promises. He recognized their destiny was great. He had been taught this from Jochebed in those first 10 years that had never left him by God's grace and blessing in his heart. And now, age 40, he sides with God's people and turns his back on all the prospects, all the wealth, all the promise of being a prince in Pharaoh's house. What a moment this is in his life. And then there is that statement we mentioned in Hebrews 11, verse 27, by faith he left Egypt. And the chronology in Hebrews 11 indicates that the reference is not to the Exodus, but it's to this moment in Midian. That he goes from Egypt into Midian in this faith that he will be back. He's not able to stay in Egypt now because of the hatred of Thutmose III, who's out to get him and any chance to injure the name of Hatshepsut. And so Moses leaves Egypt with this confidence that God's hand is upon him and that he will return in a suitable time, in a future time, by faith. He left Egypt waiting on God to bring him back. And then the third aspect of his experience is the killing of the Egyptian. Was this wrong? Was this right? Was this unjust? Was this fair? It's never condemned in Scripture. It's never held against Moses. There's no chastening on Moses for this indicated by God. Is it because he is God's leader and the conqueror of God's enemies that this is the case? That there will be a lot more Egyptians slain later on in the Exodus? It seems that in the record here, there is an indication of the justness of what Moses did. So if you look at verse number 11 and verse number 12, there are two words different in our English version, which are exactly the same words in Hebrew. In verse 11, we have an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And then in verse 12, we have he struck down the Egyptian. And the words beating and the word struck are exactly the same. So just linger over that connection that's deliberate here and being made. So here is the Egyptian taskmaster, and he is unjustly, unfairly beating the Hebrew slave. In response to that, not the slave, but Moses defends the Hebrew slave by doing exactly the same thing to the Egyptian taskmaster. He beat the taskmaster who was beating the Hebrew slave. And so there seems to be this eye for an eye, which is the fair law of God, in this case, a just treatment for an unjust taskmaster. But it brought all kinds of problems to Moses, didn't it? Even if it is within God's law, the way it was perceived and understood. Here's the insurrectionists, here's the slave society rising up against the taskmasters. This cannot happen. And Moses realized that he would have to leave in these circumstances. So all make mistakes in adulthood. Some make big sinful mistakes. And it causes all kinds of disruptions for them, for their family, for their church, for their work. But then there's those other things that happen to us, often out of love and enthusiasm and a sense of justice, just like Moses here. But the way they're understood and perceived brings a whole lot of hassle and discomfort and unease to our circumstances. Maybe we were defending someone else and we got into all kinds of issues over this. It maybe was an action that had consequences that we never intended. It maybe was an action inside God's law, but which the world has misconstrued because there are enemies in some way. Every person, as we pass through adulthood, enters into some crucible. Something that we get into that perhaps like Moses is beyond our control and brings us all kinds of discomfort and unease. But this paragraph is assuring us that every detail of this is part of God's amazing plan for Moses and for you. And this brings us to our last paragraph, verses 22 to 25. So the king of Pharaoh dies in verse number 23. This is probably Thutmose III, who hated Moses' adopted mother and consequently hates Moses. This is around 1450 BC. So because of his hatred of Moses, he hated the people of Israel and he increased the oppression on them. So when he died in verse number 23, the people hoped for an easier time, for a relief from their enslavement and oppression. But this did not happen in verse 23. The people of Israel still groaned because of their slavery. Under Thutmose III, they were oppressed. But the next ruler, Amenhotep II, he continued to oppress them. And they're still groaning because of their slavery. But God is working in this. And for the first time in the history of Israel, we read in verse number 23, they cried out for rescue. They prayed unto the Lord and asked him for help. Here in this ongoing adversity, this people are turning not to Pharaoh, not to their taskmasters, not even to themselves, but they're turning to God for help. What kind of God is he then? What kind of God is he who looks over the adversity of his people, who orders all our childhood and all our adulthood? He's described at the end of this chapter. You see how the writer brings us into this climax and this end of the introductory chapters in Exodus. He uses 4 verbs to describe God's actions towards his suffering people, verbs to be memorized by us and prayed over by us in our dark days. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. And not only does the writer emphasize God's activity here, but he emphasizes that It's God who's doing this by placing God before the four verbs, something syntactically he doesn't have to do. God heard, God remembered, God saw, God knew. Al Martin has this great story of traveling to a church meeting in America. It's quite a journey, hours and hours, and he was traveling with his elders. And he was complaining about some issue within the congregation. And then he caught himself on and says, I'm really sorry, men, to be bothering you with this issue. But they replied to him by saying, if you can't complain to us, who can you complain to? And he found great solace in this, that he could share his burdens with these people who cared for him. This is the emphasis here. The people are groaning. They're crying out. But who are they crying out to? What's at the other end of their cry? A God who hears, a God who remembers, a God who sees, a God who knows. We often groan in private, don't we? But God hears. We often forget God's promises or doubt God's promises in our affliction, but God remembers. We often put on a good face, a nice face, but God sees. And God knows perfectly, fully, ultimately. So what a chapter this is, isn't it? Our childhood is planned. Our adulthood is pardoned. And our God is present. When Stephen reflects on the early years of Moses in his sermon before the Sanhedrin in Acts chapter 7, he enters into redemptive historical mode, and he sees that the rejection of Moses by the Hebrews at age 40 here was a type of the rejection of Jesus. What Israel did then, they have done to the Lord Jesus. And we are sitting here this evening and we're saying, what madness. What madness for Israel at the Exodus to reject Moses. What madness for people in the New Testament to reject Jesus. But are you rejecting Jesus? Are you keeping Jesus out of your life? I'm really interested in the rise in the theft of eggs in supermarkets. And the theft of eggs in supermarkets is not some Joe Bloggs going in there and raffling a few boxes and putting them in the bag and legging it out the door with a security man or woman pursuing them up the street. It's far more subtle than that. Joe Bloggs or Mary Brown goes into the shop and she comes to the high-priced eggs. And she takes the high-priced eggs out of the box and puts them in the low-priced eggs box, and takes the low-priced eggs and puts them in the high-priced eggs box, and then goes to the counter and pays her £2 for the £5 worth high-priced eggs. But if you're rejecting Christ, you're doing the very opposite. You're taking the high-priced eggs out of your box, and you're replacing them with the low-priced eggs. Something other than Christ. You're going to go home tonight with that action. Choosing someone else, something else than the precious, precious Savior.